Hi folks, welcome to episode 109 of the Epochs of the Lotus Eaters. I'm joined by Bo, and today we're going to be discussing Eleanor of Aquitaine, very influential 12th century lady. I didn't think such things existed. No, we keep making this comment. Every time we talk about a woman in history, we've got to stop making it. But no, she's tremendously famous and powerful in her own lifetime.
Yeah, a standout figure, in my opinion. I mean, she was the Queen of France, and then the Queen of England, the mother of two kings of England, and the heiress to the fabulously rich and huge Duchy of Aquitaine, sometimes pronounced Aquitaine. I'm going to pronounce it Aquitaine.
But the French is pronounced that way, but...
So, fantastically influential, and also a very long life. She lived to be in her early 80s, 82, 83 years old. And from the age of about 15, she was on the stage of history. So for 65 plus years. She's
like their version of Queen Elizabeth II.
Yeah, or a Victoria figure. But much more than either of those queens, because neither of those queens really wielded actual power, or she did at various points. And her life was just unbelievably action-packed. She went on the Second Crusade.
Yeah. Oh, what? Did she actually? Oh, I didn't realise that.
She was in prison for about 15, 16 years.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
And got out and went on to be a regent in all but name of England afterwards. Oh, just a crazy up and down roller coaster life. Unbelievably full of events.
Okay. I knew a bit about it, but I didn't know that.
So there are, in fact, just to say, straight away here, that her life is so action-packed that it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's loads more. We could do a mini-series on her, to be quite honest, because her life touches on the lives of everyone important. From the Emperor of Byzantium,
the Eastern Roman Empire.
So loads of her children went on to be really important, not just the kings of England, but other ones. She had like 10 kids.
Blimey.
Or 10, 11 kids, not all, about 7 or 8 of them survived anyway. So it goes on and on. Again, just to say straight off the bat, some of the historiography side of things, some of the chroniclers, John of Salisbury, William of Tyre is a bit later, but still a great source. Roger of Wendover, I've got a couple of quotes from old Roger of Wendover later. Another thing I want to say straight away before we get into the details of it is, I've said it before about other people in history, like Augustus and the Duke of Wellington. When you're introduced to them, perhaps as a child, a fictionalized version of them, it sort of colours or clouds your view of them until you, if in adulthood, you read real histories. Well, I had that with Eleanor of Aquitaine, and I think a lot of people will have done, with the film, the 1968 classic, The Lion in Winter, where she's played by Katharine Hepburn.
Oh, really?
Not to be confused with Audrey Hepburn.
No.
Audrey Hepburn and Katharine Hepburn, two very different women. But Katharine Hepburn, an amazing actress, in that film, pardon me, plays Eleanor of Aquitaine in her old age, or not old age, but in her sort of 60s, 70s she would have been. And so it's a really interesting, great portrayal. But again, the real historical figure is a bit different. It's pretty close, though. I think it's pretty good. I love The Lion in Winter. Everyone out there should see that film. Okay, so if most people know of her, it's probably that depiction by Katharine Hepburn in that film. So should we just start?
Yeah. So
she was born in the 1120s, so all of this takes place in the 12th century, the very last few years of her life. She dies in 1204. So this is all sort of firmly 12th century stuff. Now that's quite early, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's really quite early on in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. Europe is just chaos at this point.
There is a king of France, but there's no France as we know it. It's not France as we know it in any way, shape or form.
There's a king of France, which is an enlarged area around Paris, and then the oaths sworn by the Duchy of Burgundy, and various other Brittany, Normandy, all these areas around. And the Languedoc isn't a part of France at this point, is it? So this is a separate cultural entity all of its own. And so France is kind of it's a reduced area to what we would picture France to be now. And the French language would have been far, far more parochial at that time.
So there is a king of France, but places like Anjou and Normandy and Brittany and Gascony and the Loire Valley and all sorts of Burgundy are all, and more, many more, are all independent really. A lot of them, some of them owe fealty to the king of France. But so just to say that the Aquitaine is a massive chunk, most really, of southern France and big chunks of
Southwest
central France. So from the Loire Valley all the way down to the Pyrenees, not including Gascony. I'll put maps up so people who aren't familiar will actually see what I mean.
Yeah.
It's bigger, richer, and more powerful than France itself.
Well, that's the thing. I've never been there, but I've read a lot about the area, and apparently it's very lush. It's very, very rich, very good for farming. Loads of rivers, which is where the name Aquitaine, aqua, comes from. Apparently, it's a lovely area of the world.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah,
no, definitely.
Like I said, I've never been there, but that's what I've read.
Yeah, I've been through there a few times. Yeah, and it's very, very nice. And the southern French, even to this day, or in most countries, if it's there might well be cultural, regional differences between the extreme east and west coasts of your country or the extreme north and south coasts of your country. It's the same in France. The people of the south do consider themselves fairly different to the people of central or northern France. Anyway, back then it was very much the case, very, very much the case.
Yeah.
The southern French had different.
I don't even know if they'd have called themselves French at this point.
No, they wouldn't. No.
That's the thing. It's much more sort of Italian influenced culture, much more like Latinate culture, whereas the northern area was, I guess, more Germanic because that's where the Franks, where the name comes from, had their capital, wasn't it?
A few centuries before this, there's the Frankish kingdom of Charlemagne, which gets, upon his death, gets cut up and divided between his sons. There's a Rex Francorum, the king of the Franks, there's like the East and the West Frankish kingdoms. Anyway, it's about this time in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries when the kingdom of France, the crown of France, really starts to come into its own. Here still it's not huge.
It's up for debate whether the crown of France is the most powerful entity in the region. That's the issue.
Oh, definitely.
And obviously for the next few hundred years, of course, it does become the preeminent power in the region, but it's not guaranteed at this point.
So to say, Eleanor, that Aquitaine is extremely powerful in its own right. Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine's grandfather had been very, very important. Sometimes, in fact, this happens to Eleanor herself. Sometimes people are so powerful and important in their age, in their lifetime, during their lifetimes, that they sort of set the tone for all of culture.
Oh, Queen Victoria is a great example.
Yeah, right. So Eleanor of Aquitaine's grandfather had been one of those, and he was, I think, libertine is a bit strong, but he wasn't very straight laced.
Right.
He wasn't too formal. He practiced he had a sense of humour and was baldy. Was like rude a bit and liked troubadours and singing and jesters and joking around, practical jokes, all that sort of thing. And so the people from the Aquitaine and southern France sort of took that on board, and that was certainly the milieu in which Eleanor was raised.
Well, there's a lot to be said for the sort of troubadour culture of Aquitaine and Languedoc at this time, because I've read a bunch of books about it, and they speak of it much more highly than they speak of the northern areas of France, which come across as being a lot more northwestern European. It's a lot more dour, a lot more serious, a lot more high-minded in ways, actually, with the sort of the romances that they tell each other about knightly and chivalrous virtues, right? Whereas, like you say, in Languedoc and Aquitaine, there's this culture of courtly troubadours that are entertaining. Like it feels very relaxed. And honestly, when you look back on it, maybe it was inevitable that the sort of more militaristic North was going to conquer it with the kind of attitude that the culture seems to have displayed. But it's very charming, is I think the point I'm trying to make here. And it's hard not to have an affection for this kind of culture. Like, it's sweet, it's because like this is in the period of time after the Moorish invasions that have been fought off a couple of hundred years before and no longer occur. So it's like, okay, there's this breathing space for a relaxed culture to exist, which is nice. And it's very artistic, very artistic culture. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think dour was a good word for the more northern states and places that became Belgium and Holland and Britain and Germany. A lot more dour.
Yeah.
A lot more serious. Also, another thing to say that in around this time, actually in a couple of centuries later, Burgundy became sort of the gold standard of sort of courtly etiquette and things.
Yeah.
But in this age, during Eleanor of Aquitaine's life and everything, Aquitaine was considered, the gold standard for sort of chivalry and courtly love. There's this idea of courtly love and troubadours and how you treat women. Now, what goes along with that bit more relaxed, less dour view of the world or culture is that women were given a bit more free rein. They didn't have to be completely subservient and completely silent, really. Well, in fact, Eleanor of Aquitaine, her father died when she was still fairly young. What was she, like 14 or so? And she'd had a younger brother, but he'd also died of natural causes when he was really young, like 4 or 5 years old or something. And so she inherited. She became the full heiress of the Aquitaine. And again, just to stress it, the most important piece of land in France and in Western Europe.
Yeah.
This girl of 14 or 15. Now, as you can imagine, her hand then in marriage is the most valued one.
Yeah.
So where she'd gone from, her personal stock obviously went through the roof when her father and baby brother had died.
I imagine all of the princes of Europe were trying to marry her.
Now suddenly, instead of being married off to some duke somewhere, some count somewhere, she's going to be destined for royalty now. And in fact, she marries the most eligible man in France, the King of France.
Good move for him.
Louis VII. Now, this Louis VII was a bit weak. That's sort of what history remembers him as, a little bit weak. Or he was very pious. He wasn't a martial king like Richard the Lionheart or anything. Eleanor's son.
Yeah.
But we'll get on to all of that. So, I've got a quote here from Churchill. It says of Louis VII, Louis VII was a French Edward the Confessor. He practised with faithful simplicity the law of Christ. All his days were spent in devotion and his nights in vigil or penance. When he left his own chapel, he would delay the whole court by waiting till the humblest person present had preceded him. These pious and exemplary habits did not endear him to his queen. Eleanor of Aquitaine was in her own right a reigning princess with the warmth of the South in her veins. That's a pleasant way of putting she did what she wanted.
Yeah. But also, I find this did not endear him to his queen, because you've got, I mean, like, exaggerating it into modern parlance, saying like she's a party girl or something is way too much, right? It's way too much. But the liveliness of the South compared to, as you can see, the dourness of the North, where they take their religion very, very seriously, is very evident at this point. And what's interesting, I mean, like it's the north of France that ends up crusading against Languedoc during the Cathar heresy. Only, probably less than 100 years after this particular moment that you're talking about here. So it's not even long before this sort of thing happens. And so you can see there's this massive like ley line, like this gulf between the cultures that like goes up. You can map it on, the landscape practically. It's just very interesting to me.
There's something to say about Eleanor's character, put very politely there by Churchill, the warmth of the South in her veins.
That's very rich. Very rich way of putting it.
And if you've ever seen The Lion in Winter, you'll get an idea of she's got her own mind.
Yeah.
There's a couple of ways to take this. One is that it's inspiring that she's a strong woman, and two, she's a complete liability, pain in the arse. And the reality is she's probably a bit of both.
Yeah, I was going to say it's probably both, right? Because I do admire the fact that she's got a mind of her own. But from Louis's position, probably is a nightmare. Would have been nice to have had a properly orthodox Catholic princess who knew what she was supposed to do in order to uphold the way of life he's trying to make an example of.
And it is quite rare in this time. So, yeah, the idea that Mary Beard said that women have never had political voices, there's no better example to show that being incorrect than Eleanor of Aquitaine.
What was Edward the Confessor's? There was...
Emma of Normandy?
That was it, Emma of Normandy.
Yeah.
She was another great example. Matilda, Richard's wife, William's wife. We've covered a bunch of these women because they keep popping up because they are important.
There's a Margaret of Anjou during the Wars of the Roses, incredibly headstrong and utterly powerful in her own right, completely.
Wasn't Harold Godwinson's wife incredibly important as well?
Edith the Swan-Necked.
Yeah.
Yeah, she had, right, yeah.
But anyway.
There's examples going back to...
We keep hammering this point.
Sumer.
Yeah.
There's examples going back to Sumer.
Yeah.
So, Eleanor of Aquitaine, though, she knew that she was a political power in her own right from the early stage. So she marries Louis VII when she's 15. And all the accounts seem to agree that from day one, she sort of bossed the situation.
Was she a good-looking woman?
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah.
In her youth. Extremely beautiful, yeah.
Right, okay. How old was Louis VII at this point?
He was a bit older, not much older. I think he was like 17 or 18 or something.
So he's an inexperienced young man.
And pious.
And very church-like. And suddenly you've got this very, should we call it a gregarious, beautiful young woman who comes from a different culture that has different expectations. I can see how that would be the case. Maybe if he was like in his mid to late 20s or something, the situation would be different. But yeah,
it seems like she was one of those people that sort of did, within reason, did and said whatever she wanted and hang the consequences. It doesn't really care for what other people think because she's the top of the pile and doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. She's going to do what she wants to do.
She knows the game though, right? Because she's been brought up in it and she knows her place in the hierarchy. And so once you're secure in that.
At the very top, once she's the anointed Queen of France. Yeah, there's no one to tell her no, really, most of the time.
Yeah, especially if her wife, she's got a husband a bit browbeaten.
Yeah. Also, but apparently their marriage wasn't particularly happy. They were married for about 14, 15 years. They were married. And she just didn't like the fact that he was weak.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know what springs to mind? There's a funny clip, not funny, but it's an interesting clip of Jackie Kennedy being asked in an interview once, like, what do you think about policy, about government, about the Cold War, whatever? And she just says, don't ask me. It's up to John what the policy is. She literally says, like, I'm just a woman. It's not my place to even have an opinion.
Well, Eleanor definitely doesn't agree with that.
Right. So she was the complete opposite. She was like, well, if he's not going to take the reins of power, of government, I will. I'm happy to do that, whatever. And so she was, it seems like she was basically sort of disgusted by his weakness, though.
A lot of women are. Take that note.
Right. Yeah. And
I mean, one of the reasons that Jackie Kennedy was probably like, don't ask me, I'm a woman, is because at least John Kennedy, you can't call him weak,
Right,
he at least had, a very strong, positive political platform. He was doing things, he wasn't, anyway.
The reason why I mentioned Jackie O, later Jackie Onassis, why I mentioned Jackie Kennedy was because that persisted into the 20th century. It's only very, very recently where it's completely taboo for women to be like that. So in the mid 12th century, it was very, very rare, extremely rare still. It's not that it never happened, but it was rare.
Yeah.
And they, just to cut ahead briefly, they did have 2 children, but both daughters. And not for years did she conceive. But she basically was disgusted with him, didn't want to sleep with him. He wasn't he didn't want to really sleep with her.
Yeah. He was probably too busy in prayer.
He was also a bit disgusted with her, that she was too gregarious for him, too outgoing.
Yeah. Terrible match.
Yeah. So one of the first big events that happens in 1147, when she's about 24, 25 years old, is the Second Crusade is called. And Louis decides he wants to go on it because crusades, particularly the First and Second Crusade, was something like an armed pilgrimage.
Yes.
It was very, very religious. It wasn't just purely war for its own sake.
No.
There's a very highly religious element to it, that you're saving the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from the Turk.
You're saving Christendom.
Right.
This is the thing. It was in defense of the faith entirely. I mean, we don't use the term Christendom anymore, but the Muslims do use the term Ummah, and they basically mean the same thing. The entire Muslim world and the entire Christian world. And this is one of the modern canards about the Crusades I really despise. Oh, it was just about wealth. It was just about power. No, No. It was. I mean, it was about those things.
For some,
yeah,
it was.
But it was about those things. But also, everyone, literally everyone at this point, was a raging religious zealot by our standards. So, like, there's no separating worldly affairs from spiritual affairs. Like, they didn't even conceive of such a thing. Like, as far as they were concerned, there was no separation between church and state, especially not in the 12th century. You know, maybe in the 18th century when they actually start thinking like that, but certainly not now. The world was ordered by God. The divine procession of the universe all came to a head in the king and his wife and his children, and all of this stuff. All of it was imbued with religiosity. There's no separating. So it's the Crusades were a thoroughly religious affair.
It's funny you should say that about the separation of church and state. I mean, that starts to play out a bit with Thomas Becket and Henry II like a few years after this. But yes, until then.
But even then,
But for the normal people, there'll be some landed people from Europe that go there just for power and wealth and war. But for a lot of people that took the cross, it's about rescuing Jerusalem from it's been diseased by Islam.
Yeah, by the pagan barbarian, as far as they're concerned.
The Seljuk Turk has infested Jerusalem, and we need to cleanse it.
That's exactly how they would have framed it. And so, again, I hate taking the cynical tack on this, because like, no, they genuinely believe. Just because you don't genuinely believe doesn't mean they they really believe this. You know, they thought they were saving the cosmos from disorder. Okay. Like, you know, they were crazy. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure we can all agree, but like, that's what their belief was. And I'm not going to question it.
So real quick to set this up before I do a quote, Eleanor had an uncle, Raymond, Prince of Antioch, who reigned in Antioch, her close relation, who she'd known when she was a child. And one of the main aim, as far as Louis VII was concerned, was to get to Jerusalem. Yeah,
because this is about 50 years after the First Crusade, right?
Yeah. The First Crusade they got to Jerusalem in 1099. They got... And so we're now talking 1147, and they go out there in 1148. So
because the Crusader states are set up by the First Crusade, but of course are suffering from repeated attacks from Muslim forces.
The Seljuk Turk didn't disappear after 1099, right? Yeah. The Fatimid also from Egypt. Yeah, so it's the Crusader states were sort of constantly assailed by the Muslim world still.
I'm not judging the Muslim world for that. You know, I would have done the same had I been them.
So she's got this uncle Raymond out in Antioch, and they're going to pass through that way. You go past Antioch. So if I read a couple of quotes here, I've got a fairly long quote here from a book by Antonia Fraser. She wrote, Eleanor of Aquitaine was the great feudal heiress whose marriage to Louis VII of France in 1137, shortly after the death of her father, brought him, Louis VII, vast possessions. At the time of her marriage, Eleanor was only 15, and the complicated future which awaited her, gifted as she was with beauty, riches, and the intelligence to make use of her gifts, could hardly have been foreseen. Eleanor, therefore, was still a comparatively young woman on that Easter day, 1146, when she knelt before the celebrated orator, the Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, at Vassalaie, and, moved by his eloquence, offered him her thousands of vassals for what was to become the Second Crusade. She was attended by numerous ladies of quality as she knelt, bearers of such heraldic names as Cybele, Countess of Flanders, Mamille of Ruchy, Florine of Bourgogne, Torquerie of Bouillon, and Fadide of Toulouse. It was one thing for a great lady to pledge her vassals, but quite another for her to go on crusade herself. This, however, was what Queen Eleanor proceeded to do, and opinions have varied concerning the reason. Did chivalry demand the presence of a woman at the centre of this pious procession? More humanly, did King Louis himself fear for the consequences of leaving his fascinating young wife at home? Whatever the reason, the chronicler who related the episode considered that the Queen's departure, surrounded by her ladies, set an extremely bad example for the female sex as a whole. Furthermore, the papal bull, which promulgated the crusade, and which was read aloud at Vassalaie, expressly forbade the attendance of concubines on the expedition. It was at this moment, according to legend, that Queen Eleanor suddenly appeared among the crowds at Vassalaie, taking the cross, riding a white horse and herself dressed in the guise of an Amazon. with gilded buskins, type boots, really, buskins, with gilded buskins on her feet and plumes in her hair. Surrounded by her ladies, similarly, if less gorgeously attired, the Queen galloped through the crowds, urging on the faithful to join the crusade in a deliberate imitation of Panthenslia, who's an Amazon queen who appears in the Iliad. Achilles kills her, actually. So an Amazon warrior queen, and her soldier women. Her squadron of ladies also distributed white distaffs to the faint-hearted, an early form of the First World War's white feather. According to Nicetas, who's actually a Byzantine historian, chronicler, according to Nicetas, the Queen kept up her enjoyable classical charade along the route to the Holy Land. So LARPing all the way, it seems to me. The Greek historian wrote of the women dressed as men, mounted on horses and armed with lance and battle axe, and they kept a martial mien, bold as Amazons. And he mentioned that at the head, quote, one particular, presumably Eleanor, richly dressed, went by the name of the Lady of the Golden Boot. The elegance of her bearing and the freedom of her movements recalling the celebrated leader of the Amazons. In a bold gesture, this is Fraser goes on, Antonia Fraser goes on. In a bold gesture, Queen Eleanor had thus separated herself from the category of mortal women, mere concubines, albeit royal, and other female companions. By her plumes and her bold buskins, she had appealed ostentatiously to the past, and declared in so doing her right to accompany the crusade. It should perhaps be noted in conclusion that the bull for the next crusade, the Third Crusade, 1189, expressly forbade women of all sorts to join the expedition by general agreement of all the Christian monarchs, including King Louis. But by this time, Queen Eleanor had been married to King Henry II of England for nearly 40 years.
It's very interesting because I feel that this wasn't Louis's choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, like the question, maybe Louis didn't want to leave her home. I mean, he probably wouldn't have wanted to leave her home, but I don't think that this was his decision. She seems to have taken that southern energy and realized, I can make a big show of this. You know, this because again, like she comes from that kind of expressive culture. I mean, one might say she's not taking it seriously.
I get the impression that Louis, she was a total embarrassment to him.
Yes.
What an embarrassment.
Because another thing as well, like not just the religiosity of crusading, right? There's a chivalrous exuberance in knightly garb and knightly behavior, right? But one of the interesting things about the crusade is that it's a deliberate act of remittance of sins.
Yeah, right.
And so there was always with the Crusades an undertone of seriousness, because actually a lot of people going would have been criminals who were trying to save their immortal souls. And you see this in the First Crusade as well. And there's also the like extreme religiosity of it with this sort of peasants' crusade at the beginning with the hermit, Peter the Hermit.
Peter the Hermit.
Yeah. Where it's not this LARP. But it's actually very grim and no, we're very serious, you know. And so she is, as you say, she kind of embarrassing that she's kind of missing the point with her southern exuberance.
Her LARPing. Yeah, you said undertones there. I'd say explicit overtones. It's deadly serious.
Sure.
You're fighting for the most sacred thing in the world, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and your immortal soul.
And it's a
Deadly
very dangerous
serious
thing to do.
Right, yeah.
But the thing is, conversely, a lot of the Norman and Frankish knights on the First Crusade, I've read various accounts of it, and there are points that they are being very frivolous themselves, right? When they take Antioch, for example, and things like this, you know, they and when they are disrespectful to the emperor of the Greeks, the Holy Roman Emperor, and sit on his throne and stuff like this, like so.
Tancred. Yeah,
it's not that there's no frivolity, and so, like I said, I didn't want to make it, but it is a very serious endeavor overall, right? It's not there aren't people who aren't jackasses, because there are, but she's really taking the crown on that one there.
She's LARPing, it seems to me, dressing up as an Amazon.
Yeah.
I can only imagine that, well, not only imagine, the accounts say that the normal French people, because she brought with her on crusade loads of her own vassals and knights, and they were all of the same mind as her.
Yeah.
But all the others were embarrassed by it, really. There's one or two accounts where she would ride through the Anatolian countryside bare-breasted.
I imagine that went down brilliantly.
With the very, very pious Louis VII. Yeah.
And I can only imagine what the Muslims were saying back in their camps.
Right.
There's a bare-breasted French woman.
The Queen.
On crusade. It's like, what are you talking about? Are you serious?
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.